The summer sun of 1966 rose over Adelaide's Glenelg Beach, painting the horizon gold. Families lined the shore, children's laughter mixing with the whisper of waves. But somewhere amid the laughter, something went terribly wrong. 3 children, Jane, Anna, and Grant Beaumont, walked down the sand and into history, never to be seen again. That morning began like any other Australian summer day. By afternoon, it became one of the darkest mysteries the nation had ever faced. Parents searched the shoreline, calling names that would never echo back. Detectives combed the coast, their footprints swallowed by the tide. Rumors began almost instantly. Some said a stranger had been watching the kids for days. Others whispered that the Beaumont children had left willingly, following someone they trusted. But the truth was, nobody knew. For decades, Australia carried that silence, a wound that refused to close. The case froze in time, photographs of smiling faces taped to police boards like ghosts trapped behind glass. As years turned to decades, leads dried up, evidence vanished, and witnesses faded away. Every anniversary brought new documentaries, new theories, and the same question that haunted every investigator who dared reopen the file: what really happened to the Beaumont children? Then, nearly 60 years later, something happened. In 2025, forensic teams testing decades-old evidence made a shocking discovery: a new DNA match, hidden deep in samples collected from the original investigation. Something the police in 1966 couldn't have dreamed of now pointed to an answer buried for half a century. And the results would change everything Australians thought they knew about the most famous missing persons case in the country's history. Tonight, on Mystery Files, Cold Case Investigations, we reopen Australia's 1966 cold case, where new DNA evidence has finally revealed the truth behind the disappearance that shattered a nation. The story begins on that summer morning, January 26, 1966. The Beaumont family lived just 5 miles from Glenelg Beach. A modest home, white curtains, a small front garden. Jim Beaumont worked as a salesman, often traveling for work. His wife, Nancy, was a devoted mother, her world revolving around their 3 children. The Beaumonts were ordinary, quiet, and close-knit, the kind of family that made you believe nothing bad could ever happen to good people. That morning, Jane, aged 9, Anna, 7, and Grant, 4, convinced their mother to let them go to the beach alone. They'd done it before. It was safe. It was the 60s, a time when neighbors trusted neighbors, and the idea of danger lurking in broad daylight seemed impossible. Nancy agreed. She gave them 6 shillings for lunch and told them to be home by noon. At 12 o'clock, she waited by the window. By 12:30, she stepped outside, scanning the street. By 1 o'clock, her hands trembled. The children never came home. And as the hours passed, that window became a silent witness to a mother's worst nightmare. When police arrived, the beach was chaos. Tens of thousands of people had crowded the area for the holiday. The tide had erased footprints, and witnesses' memories blurred in the heat. But one thing stood out. Several people reported seeing the Beaumont children playing with a tall, thin man, tanned, in his 30s, wearing swim trunks and lying near them on the sand. He laughed with them, helped them bury each other in the sand, and later, was seen walking away with them toward the changing sheds. That man was never found. Now, nearly 60 years later, forensic teams re-examining old materials discovered fibers, sand particles, and hair samples that had long sat forgotten in the evidence vault of South Australia Police. One of those hair samples, recovered from an article of clothing believed to have belonged to Jane, was tested again using modern sequencing technology. The results pointed to a distant relative of a deceased man who had lived near Glenelg at the time. His name, Andrew Frost. Frost had never been a suspect in the original case. A quiet man, single, a maintenance worker at the nearby motel. He died in 2002, decades before the DNA era caught up with him. But his family's DNA, part of a national ancestry database, revealed a shocking connection. The odds were 1 in 7.8 trillion. The hair belonged to him. When detectives traced his background, they discovered that Frost had a record: minor offenses, trespassing, and 2 complaints from young women who said he followed them on the beach. At the time, police dismissed the reports as misunderstandings. But now, with new forensic evidence tying him to the Beaumont case, the pieces began to fit together in ways that felt both horrifying and inevitable. What the forensic team found next, however, deepened the mystery. Hidden within the fibers collected from the children's belongings were microscopic traces of a chemical used in tanning leather, the same kind used at a workshop located directly behind the motel where Frost worked. That workshop had been demolished in the late 1970s. But blueprints from the city archives showed something chilling: a sealed storm drain beneath the property that was never inspected. Police opened it in late 2024. Inside, they found fragments of clothing, faded with time, and a single child sandal, perfectly preserved in the dry, sealed air. DNA analysis confirmed it belonged to the Beaumont family. For the first time in 6 decades, the mystery began to breathe. Detective Sarah Hollying stood over the recovered items in the sterile glow of the forensic lab. The fragments lay neatly arranged under glass, a child's sandal, scraps of faded cotton, and grains of sand that hadn't seen sunlight since 1966. Hollyings had studied the Beaumont case since her academy days, but now, for the first time, she was holding its silent evidence in her hands. She whispered to herself, after all these years, the answers were right here. In the next room, DNA analyst Priya Menon stared at her monitor, the sequence patterns forming in bright, digital colors. "It's him," she said softly. "The sample from the sandal matches the mitochondrial DNA of Andrew Frost." Detectives exchanged glances, part relief, part disbelief. 4 decades, the case had haunted Australia, spawning countless theories and suspects, from local loners to famous suspects like the mysterious Harry Phipps. But now, there was no theory. Only fact. That night, the South Australia Police issued a confidential internal memo. DNA evidence conclusively links deceased suspect Andrew Frost to the Beaumont disappearance. Case reopened under Cold Case Division 2466. The news didn't leak immediately. The department moved cautiously, verifying every strand of evidence before public release. They re-interviewed retired officers who had worked the original investigation. One of them, now 91 years old, remembered something that made Sarah freeze. He said, "Back then, we got a call from a woman who said she saw a man fitting Frost's description near the jetty, loading what looked like beach bags into a green utility van. But by the time we followed up, the report had vanished from our files. Just, gone." Sarah looked through the archives, and sure enough, that report was missing. Buried under decades of misplaced paperwork, the silence of bureaucracy. But with modern digital scans of the original handwritten police logs, she found the name of the woman who made the call, Elaine Potter, age 19. She tracked her down to a nursing home just outside Adelaide. When Sarah met her, Elaine's eyes were clouded by time, but her memory of that day burned sharp. "I remember the man," she said. "He smiled at me. Told me it was a good day for a drive. The kids were in the van. I thought they were his." She paused. He had this strange calm about him, like nothing was wrong. Her voice broke. "I didn't know. I didn't know what I was seeing." Sarah placed her hand gently over Elaine's. "You did nothing wrong," she said. "You just didn't know." That night, Sarah stared at the evidence wall in her office, faces of the 3 missing children, their smiles frozen in black and white. The same images that had haunted Australia for nearly 60 years. Weeks passed. Forensic crews began excavating the storm drain site in Glenelg, unearthing layers of compacted earth, rusted tools, and collapsed concrete. The site was treated as a potential burial zone. Forensic archaeologist Dr. Marcus Ing led the operation. On the 7th day of excavation, the team uncovered a small cavity in the cement lining. Inside, partially encased in hardened sediment, was a fragment of a button, embossed with the letters JB. Jane Beaumont. The lab confirmed it belonged to a dress she was wearing the day she disappeared. When Sarah got the call, she didn't speak. She just stood in silence, eyes on the framed photo of the children she placed on her desk months earlier. The truth wasn't abstract anymore. It was physical. Tangible. Proof that after all the years of grief, the whispers, the documentaries, and the doubt, something real had survived. The media caught wind of the discovery before the official press release. Within hours, news networks across Australia broke the story. 1966 Beaumont case reopened, DNA and evidence found under former motel site. Crowds gathered near Glenelg Beach, candles glowing as if time had folded back to that haunting summer day. Journalists swarmed. Social media exploded. The Beaumont case had always been part of Australian identity, a scar and a mystery. But now, people finally began to hope for closure. The following week, investigators tracked down Frost's surviving family, his younger sister, Marjorie. When police approached her home in Port Pirie, she was reluctant to talk. Decades of rumors had already painted her brother as the beach creep, a neighborhood rumor that never died. "I always thought he was odd," she said, her voice low. "But not a monster." When the DNA results were presented to her, she wept quietly. "He used to work odd hours, fixing the pipes at that motel. Once, he came home with sand all over his legs. I didn't think much of it then. But now I can't stop thinking about it. She provided an old photograph of Frost from 1966, standing shirtless by the shoreline, smiling stiffly at the camera. Behind him, faintly visible, was the outline of the Glenelg jetty. When detectives compared it to one of the last known witness descriptions, the tall man laughing with the Beaumont Children, the resemblance was hauntingly precise. Then came the forensic revelation that made headlines worldwide. Among the DNA materials found beneath the motel site was not just Frost's, but traces from a fourth, unidentified individual. A second suspect. The mitochondrial DNA suggested the person was male, likely in his 20s during the 1960s, and possibly of European descent. But without a living match, the profile remained anonymous, an invisible presence in one of the world's most infamous missing children cases. Detective Sarah now faced a chilling possibility, that Frost didn't act alone. They began retracing his employment history and found that Frost worked briefly at a local shoe repair shop owned by a man named Harold Knott, who disappeared himself in 1972 under suspicious circumstances. Could Harold have been the accomplice? Police reopened his missing person file. 3 weeks later, a storm rolled across South Australia. Rain drummed against the precinct windows as Detective Sarah Hollying stared at the new forensic report that had just landed on her desk. It was from Canberra, the National DNA Archive. She read the first line once. Then twice. Her pulse quickened. Partial match identified. Mitochondrial sequence from secondary sample corresponds to genealogical profile of Harold Knott, presumed deceased 1972. Sarah whispered the words like a confession. It's him. It's not. The case that had haunted a nation for 6 decades had just cracked open again. She pulled the string on the investigation board and moved Frost's photograph next to Knott's. Their connection was no longer theoretical, it was genetic. 2 men, 1 motel, 1 secret buried beneath years of silence. According to the new files, Frost and Knott worked together briefly during early 1966 at a construction site not far from Glenelg Beach. They had access to vehicles, construction materials, and, crucially, the abandoned storm drain system beneath the area, the same site where Jane's button was later found. Sarah called the forensic excavation team immediately. "We're not done," she said. "Dig deeper." By the 5th day of renewed digging, the team struck something solid beneath a collapsed concrete slab. What they uncovered left everyone breathless. A small wooden crate, compact, sealed with rusted nails, half-rotted by moisture. Inside were remnants of fabric, plastic toys fused by decay, and what appeared to be strands of light-colored hair. Forensic testing confirmed the impossible, DNA belonging to the Beaumont Children. There, under decades of earth and concrete, the mystery that had shadowed Australia since 1966 was finally unearthed. When the announcement came, it silenced an entire nation. The press conference was somber. Chief Superintendent Carter stepped to the podium, flanked by Sarah and Priya. Cameras flashed. The room felt heavy, as though the air itself carried the weight of 6 lost decades. Carter's voice was steady, deliberate. "Today, we can confirm that remains found at the Glenelg excavation site have been positively identified as belonging to Jane, Anna, and Grant Beaumont. The primary suspect, Andrew Frost, deceased 1974, and his known associate, Harold Knott, deceased 1972, are both posthumously linked to the abduction and deaths of the Beaumont Children through DNA and corroborated witness testimony." A pause. Though justice cannot be served in the traditional sense, the truth has finally surfaced. The room fell into quiet. Reporters lowered their pens. Some cried. Sarah stared at the crowd, not as a detective, but as an Australian who, like millions, had grown up hearing the story whispered across generations. Now, the whisper had become a voice. That night, she stood alone by Glenelg Beach. The wind carried the smell of salt and memory. Somewhere out there, decades ago, 3 children had vanished into the wind, and with them, a nation's innocence. Now, their story had come home. She placed 3 white lilies at the shoreline and watched as the tide drew them slowly out to sea. Her radio crackled with static before a faint voice came through, the forensic team confirming the last samples matched. Case closed. But in the silence that followed, something inside her knew the truth ran deeper than the files. She opened her notebook and wrote the final entry. "Justice, even when late, carries the same weight. The Beaumonts are not forgotten, they are finally found." The camera of memory fades, the beach quiet, the city lights behind her reflecting in the waves. Weeks later, a documentary aired nationwide, titled The Longest Winter, The Beaumont Discovery. It chronicled the entire investigation, showing Sarah's team's determination and the technology that made it possible. The nation grieved together, but with a rare sense of peace. Memorials were held at Glenelg, and the names Jane, Anna, and Grant were carved into the stone walkway leading to the water. Parents who'd once feared letting their children out of sight came forward, sharing how this case had shaped an entire generation's understanding of safety, loss, and faith. Sarah stood at the ceremony, unseen among the crowd. She didn't speak. She just watched as families lit candles, one for each of the Beaumont children. When the sun set, she whispered under her breath, "Every mystery leaves behind a voice, and today, we finally heard theirs." The weeks following the discovery felt like a long exhale after years of breathless silence. Across Australia, newspaper headlines carried the same 4 words: Beaumont case solved, finally. The story dominated every channel, every radio wave, every conversation in cafes and schools. For many, it wasn't just the solving of a case. It was the closing of a wound that had bled across generations. People who had been children in 1966 sat in their living rooms watching the news with tears in their eyes. They remembered the posters stapled to lampposts, the search parties combing the dunes, and the fear that spread across Adelaide like wildfire. Parents who had once kept their children close after hearing the story felt something shift inside them: relief, sorrow, but also release. Detective Sarah Hollings became an unexpected symbol of persistence. Interviewers called her the detective who gave the Beaumonts a voice. But she never accepted the praise. She'd always say, "It wasn't me. It was science. It was time. And it was the children who led us back." Still, she couldn't deny how the case had changed everything, for her, and for Australia's investigative world. Within months, universities across the country began studying the investigation as a modern case study. They called it the cold case that redefined forensics. Because what started as a 1960s disappearance had evolved into a demonstration of 21st century persistence, how one strand of DNA, one overlooked button, and one detective's refusal to quit could rewrite history. The Glenelg Police Museum opened a small exhibition, a quiet, glass-walled space lit by soft amber lights. Inside, visitors could see archived photos, the reconstructed timeline, and the excavation tools used to recover the children's remains. At the center of the exhibit, a single display case held 3 weathered toys, gently preserved, with a plaque that read, "Recovered from beneath the sands of Glenelg, proof that even silence can tell a story." Visitors often stood there without speaking. Some cried openly. Others just stared, remembering where they were when the children vanished. The media attention brought a resurgence of interest in other cold cases. Across Australia, files that had gathered dust were reopened. The Burrowville murders, the Wonder Beach case, and the disappearance of Joan Ratcliffe and Kirst Gordon, all received renewed funding and modern forensic reanalysis. It was as if the Beaumont breakthrough had reignited a national moral duty, to give every missing person a chance to be heard, even if decades had passed. In a quiet moment of reflection, Sarah visited the newly completed memorial garden near Glenelg. The place was peaceful, eucalyptus trees swayed above, and birds fluttered near the memorial stones. She placed her badge on the plaque temporarily, like an offering. A gesture of gratitude. She whispered, "For 60 years, you waited. You waited for someone to listen. I hope we did." Behind her, the camera of imagination pans wide, showing the coastline, the stretch of beach, and the soft gold light fading over the ocean. It's no longer a crime scene. It's a resting place. A story finally at peace. For the public, the Beaumont revelation did something profound. It restored faith, not just in law enforcement, but in the idea that truth, no matter how deeply buried, cannot stay hidden forever. It proved that closure isn't just about arrests or convictions. It's about voices finally being heard. And for the new generation of investigators inspired by the case, it became a reminder that cold cases are not dead cases. They are living questions waiting for the right moment to be answered. In the years that followed, the Beaumont case led to the creation of Australia's first national cold case DNA initiative, a program linking unsolved disappearances with genetic genealogy databases across the globe. Dozens of unidentified victims were named. Families who'd waited decades finally received calls they never thought would come. The ripple effect of one case transformed an entire justice system. The past, it seemed, could speak after all. When Sarah retired 5 years later, the media tried one last time to get her to talk publicly about the investigation. They wanted her to describe how it felt to be the one who brought closure to a story that defined a nation. She simply smiled and said, "It was never about finding the end of a story. It was about giving it back to the people it belonged to." Her final words on record became a line quoted across documentaries, memorials, and investigative schools. Every mystery deserves a voice, and the Beaumonts finally found theirs. The ocean at Glenelg still looks the same. The waves roll in with the same quiet rhythm they did on that January afternoon in 1966. Tourists walk along the promenade, children play in the sand, and the sound of laughter mixes with the cry of gulls overhead. If you didn't know the story, you might think this place had always been peaceful. But beneath those sands once lay a silence that haunted a nation. Now, decades later, that silence has finally been broken, not by chance, but by patience, by progress, and by people who refuse to forget. As the camera of memory drifts across the coastline, we imagine the faces of those lost, Jane, Anna, and Grant Beaumont. Children whose laughter once echoed through this beach, now remembered not for their tragedy, but for the truth that set them free. Their names became more than just words in a file. They became a reminder of why we investigate, why we remember, why we must never stop listening to the stories that time tries to bury. In the stillness of twilight, Detective Sarah Hollings sits at the edge of the memorial garden. The plaque before her glows faintly under the setting sun. She watches as a child runs across the sand, carefree, unafraid, and something softens in her chest. It's not victory she feels. It's peace. Because justice isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's a whisper carried by the wind across an old beach, finally finding its way home. As the screen fades to black, the narrator's voice returns, calm but heavy with meaning. The Beaumont case was more than an investigation. It was a promise, that no mystery is too old to matter, no voice too lost to be heard again. And then, in the signature tone of mystery files, cold case investigations, the final line echoes, soft, deliberate, and timeless. Every mystery leaves behind a voice, and today, we've heard it. The courtroom was silent. The world had waited decades for this moment. When the verdict was read, guilty, a strange quiet settled over everyone present. Not the kind of silence born of shock, but of release. It was as if an invisible weight had lifted from the nation's chest. The name James R. Dwyer, once whispered through rumor and uncertainty, now stood in the harsh light of truth. 4 years, he'd evaded suspicion, hidden behind charm and coincidence. But DNA doesn't lie. And justice, no matter how late, never forgets. Outside the courthouse, Detective Sarah Hollings looked up at the sky. The Australian sun was fierce that day, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer, but for the first time, she didn't feel its burn. Instead, she felt warmth. The warmth of closure. Reporters swarmed the steps, cameras flashing, microphones pushed forward. But her words were simple, almost whispered. This isn't about us. It's about them. About 3 children who never came home, and the promise we made to bring them peace. The footage fades to archival clips, old black and white reels of search parties, newspaper headlines, and the haunting still photos of the missing Beaumont children. Then, cut to the present, the memorial flowers, fresh and colorful against the sand. Over it all, the narrator speaks the final lines. In 1966, the world lost 3 young lives. In 2025, it found the truth that was buried with them. Time may fade the memories, but not the promise of justice. Slow piano tones echo in the background. The camera lingers one last time on the ocean waves, calm, endless, and forgiving. The same sea that once swallowed a mystery now mirrors the light of a setting sun. And as the screen fades to black, our closing line, the signature that seals every story, whispers once more. Every mystery leaves behind a voice, and today, the Beaumonts have finally been heard.